Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm your host Daniel Watkins, and today's episode has a special Shakespearean theme. If you've ever read or seen William Shakespeare's play Henry IV Part 1, you might have come across the characters of Hotspur and the Earl of Northumberland, two figures who are very important in Alnwick Castle's history as well. I was joined at the castle by Shakespearean expert Ronan Paterson to talk about the connections between Shakespeare, Alnwick Castle and the Percy family, and plenty more Shakespearean subjects besides. Here is our conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. I am very happy to be joined on this special Shakespearean edition of the Alnwick Castle podcast by the internationally renowned Shakespeare scholar and director, Ronan Paterson. How are you?
Very good, thank you, Daniel. Lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you. As people are listening to this, it is the week of the anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. So we'll start, before we get into Alnwick Castle, by asking about your background and your connection with Shakespeare. How did you find him?
Actually, when I was quite young, I was actually at school in America, and people were talking about English things and, generally in very disparaging things, although I'm not English, as you can probably hear. And I felt obliged to defend them. And one of the things I focused on in trying to sort of boast about the virtues of the British Isles in general was William Shakespeare, who I had not really at that stage read. And I came back and went to secondary school in Scotland. And when I was there, I had a wonderful English teacher. And so many people who were interested in theatre or interested in literature or art or whatever will say, oh, we had this wonderful inspirational teacher. And I had a wonderful English teacher whose name is Anne Bridges, and still alive, bless her. And she instilled in me a passion for Shakespeare, which began at the age of about 11, I think.
We'll give a shout out to Mrs. Adams from my school as well, my English teacher. So Shakespeare has been a part of your life ever since, and it's been part of Alnwick Castle's life for a very long time as well. But can you tell us a little bit about how Alnwick Castle connects to William Shakespeare?
Well, it's interesting because William Shakespeare, as far as we know, never set foot in this part of the world. You can argue, as some people do, that he spent a bit of time in his lost years over in Lancashire, but that is contentious. And if he did, he certainly never set a scene there. He never had a Lancastrian character other than the House of Lancaster and the history plays. And in the northeast, i.e. north of York, there aren't really any scenes by Shakespeare until you get to Scotland and find Macbeth. But although in his early years as a playwright, the Northumberland family did appear as characters in the Henry VI plays, they're very minor characters and they're just not really differentiated. And later on, when he comes to write about Hotspur and the Percys in Henry IV, there's been a clear shift because the Northumberland family are actually depicted in a lot of detail. Obviously, Hotspur is the main one who is depicted, but his father is as well, and his wife is, and his uncle is. And there are all kinds of elements which suggest a much closer degree of knowledge. Now, you can argue that perhaps Shakespeare, writing these a bit later in his career, had spent more time at court and maybe observed people. But actually, his depiction of Hotspur, who is the main, most charismatic northern character in all of his plays, there are some details in that. There's a detail with which Hotspur is drawn, which is fascinating. One of the things that's fascinating about it is it bears absolutely no relation whatsoever
to the real historical Hotspur.
To the real historical Hotspur. Absolutely, Daniel. Yeah. I mean, the real historical Hotspur was an entirely different character. For a start, he was older than Henry IV. Now, in Shakespeare's play, he's the same age as Hal, and they're held up as the twin pillars. But actually, the real Hotspur was not only older than Henry, but had actually at one point been the mentor for young Hal. In fact, young Hal was one of his... What happened was that in noble houses, people were fostered. They were given to other great landowners, great lords, to learn their trade. And learning to be a knight from Hotspur was part of Prince Hal's training. The real Hotspur had also, at one stage, been employed as a diplomat by the king, and when he did so, he was highly praised, which is the exact opposite of the fiery, hot-headed Hotspur who is depicted in Shakespeare's play. So I actually directed Henry IV, a professional production of Henry IV Part 1, which appeared here in the castle. It opened here in the castle. And I was looking around and thinking, how much of this would Hotspur actually have recognized? How different is it? When I was directing the play, I had a hot-headed, ranting actor who played Hotspur and things like that. But as I researched the real Hotspur, it became a very different and much more nuanced picture. And actually, one of the things which actors try and fasten onto with Hotspur is the way he speaks. Now, if you're a historian or if you're an armchair reader of the play, the way Hotspur speaks doesn't matter. But for an actor in the theatre, it makes a huge amount of difference. And in Henry IV Part 2, Lady Percy says, "Speaking thick, which nature made his blemish, became the accents of the valiant." And actors have battled with this over the centuries. Some people, Laurence Olivier, for example, he was trying to think what would Hotspur be. He gave him a stammer, which worked quite well as a way of Hotspur's words tripping over themselves, trying to come out because he was so impulsive. And he had a lovely moment in his death. Olivier gave him a stammer on the letter W. So he ends up saying, "Thou art dead, and food for and he dies, and Hal finishes as worms." Yeah, which was a lovely moment, but was the actor's invention. Now, I have had an American scholar tell me that historically it's been proved Hotspur had a stammer on the letter W, which is, of course, complete nonsense.
Yes, I've heard urban legends about that. I've started to come to believe that he actually just had a really broad Northumbrian accent and people took it for that.
Yes, well, that's right, Daniel. This was a conversation we had earlier on when I was researching this, and I have quoted you literally all over the world, which absolutely is probably bang on. But certainly his father and his ancestors had Northumbrian accents, and they were very confusing for the court in London. In fact, people thought he was speaking Scots. But anyway, if Hotspur did have a Northumbrian accent, one of the features of the mid-Northumbrian accent is the uvular r, the r in Northumbrian. And local legend has it that that's an imitation of Hotspur, that was Hotspur's speech impediment, and that people imitated him, and that became the accent. But actually, the specialists in accent have traced that uvular R back a couple of hundred years before Hotspur, so that isn't true. But so you think, all right, this guy's supposed to be really hot-headed, but he was actually a diplomat. This guy's supposed to have a speech impediment, but nobody can really say that he did. So I started trying to find out more about this. And there are a number of chroniclers of the Percy family, and the seminal one is a guy called de Fonblanc.
He wrote the Annals of the House of Percy in the 19th century, which is the key text that all the books since, including the most recent one, Lions of the North, have drawn quite a lot of information from.
Absolutely. Now, de Fonblanc says, even his personal defects became the fashion, and we are told... and that's significant, we are told that a certain thickness or hesitation of speech with which he was afflicted was, with the sincere flattery of imitation, assumed by his admirers. Now, we are told, but he doesn't ever, in the course of the book, give any source for that. So I started looking. Now, all the subsequent historians, that's Brennan, that's Rose, that's Lomas, that's all of these people, they all take that from de Fonblanc. But actually, if you go back to his own time, if you go back to Hotspur's own time, none of the contemporary or even the slightly after chroniclers even mention this. Even Harding. Now, Harding is important because Harding was his squire. And Harding was with him from Otterburn to Shrewsbury, where he was killed. Harding was with him and knew him better than anyone else. Now, he doesn't mention it.
That's more than a 15-year period that they're together.
Absolutely. If anyone knew him that has left us a record, it was Harding. Now, the trouble with Harding is that Harding rewrote his account several times for different political climates. But even so, you would think he would mention that. But the only source we actually have for before de Fonblanc is William Shakespeare. Now, okay. Now, if we were to go beyond that and say, where did Shakespeare get this idea? And I've been doing a fair amount of research over this, and I have come to a conclusion, and I'm sharing it with you today, Daniel, for the first time in a public forum.
An exclusive.
An exclusive, yes. This is breaking news. My belief is that Shakespeare's model for Hotspur was actually the Wizard Earl. The later, another Henry Percy, who was contemporary with Shakespeare. Now, this is the most flamboyant, the most vivid character amongst all the Percys, I would say. Certainly, he's the one that, if you talk to people who know about the Percys, oh, the Wizard Earl, he's the one. You know, he was extraordinary. He was a member of Raleigh's School of Knight. He was a scientist, and insofar as science existed, it was alchemy as well. He was part of that. He had a very volatile marriage, and Hotspur in Shakespeare's play has a fairly volatile marriage. He was incredibly impulsive and pugnacious. He went to the Low Countries with the Earl of Essex expedition to support the Protestants there. And at one point, he challenged his commanding officer to a duel because he felt he was being slighted about something. And his commanding officer told him not to be so silly, and basically he got even more angry about that. The Wizard Earl would actually start a fight in an empty house, probably. He fought with his wife. He actually drew his sword on her steward on one occasion. He did all sorts of things. Now, why would Shakespeare have actually modelled on him? He was an extremely well-known character. He lived in London, and in actual fact, later on, after the play was written, they were near neighbours when they both lived in the Blackfriars. But the Wizard Earl was to come after the writing of Henry IV, Part 1, to national prominence when he was put on trial, accused of complicity in the gunpowder plot.
Yes, his cousin Thomas, the constable of Alnwick Castle, had been shot and killed escaping. He had been for dinner the night before with the Earl of Northumberland at Sion House near London. The Earl did not attend Parliament on the 5th of November and seemed only worried about them catching Thomas in case he got back to Alnwick Castle and made away with that quarter's rents.
Well, exactly. So he was a figure very much in the public eye. Now, the court in London at that time was only about 400 people. You know, the top aristocracy was only about 400 people. So anybody who was part of that small circle was known to everybody else and was talked about a great deal. And the Earl of Northumberland was part of that. But at one point, now, okay, so the fiery, hot-tempered thing, the determination to prove himself militarily. Hotspur didn't have to try to prove himself militarily. He did it for real, time and time again. And it's funny because based upon Shakespeare, some revisionist historians are now saying actually he wasn't a good general at all. At Homildon Hill, one of the historians, who I shall not embarrass by naming, actually says, oh, well, actually, he would have lost the battle left to himself. It was the Earl of Dunbar, a Scottish nobleman, who won the battle. Not at all. Hotspur won plenty of battles himself. When Hotspur was part of a massive jousting thing between the English and the French reckoned Hotspur was one of the toughest fighters. Although Hotspur did manage to lose to the Earl of Douglas twice in fights. Once Douglas actually captured his personal banner and said, "I'm planting it outside my tent. You can come and get it any time you want to." And Hotspur pursued him, and that was the Battle of
Otterburn in 1388.
Yes, absolutely. But Hotspur didn't have to prove himself. He didn't have to try particularly hard to have that martial reputation. Whereas the Wizard Earl was putting himself around a bit and throwing his weight around a bit more, perhaps because he did. But the clincher for me, and I've got the actual quote written down here, which is when he was on trial. Well, before he was on trial, in 1596, the Queen Queen Elizabeth appointed him as a special envoy to France, and he gave the reason he shouldn't do this as follows: "The imperfection of my hearing, what absurdities of necessity it must beget her, as trouble to the king, evil performance of my part of her majesty's affairs, and disgrace to myself. I hope she will rightly understand where her highness shall remember how by the first I shall force a king to speak with often repetitions and to strain his voice above ordinary." Right. So in other words, he was deaf, and when he was on trial, people had trouble understanding what he said, right? In other words, he had a speech impediment of some sort.
Really?
So for me, here we have a contemporary character who ticks far more boxes in relation to Shakespeare's character than the real Harry Hotspur.
That is fascinating. So Shakespeare would have been aware of the Wizard Earl. He would have known this character in the court.
Yes, he would. I mean, Shakespeare's company were performers at court on a number of occasions, but also Shakespeare had access to those upper circles through his close friendship with the Earl of Southampton. Now, Southampton was part of the Essex faction. The Wizard Earl was part of the Raleigh faction. The court was riven between these two. But the Earl's wife was the Earl of Essex' sister, and he actually got on very well with the Earl of Essex, even though they were part of a different political alignment. So actually, it is quite possible, although, of course, unprovable, that Shakespeare could have encountered the Wizard Earl in a number of situations, whether in performances at court and being received at court, or whether through his connections with Southampton.
And do you think this might have been a unique case, or would any of Shakespeare's other historical characters have been based on their descendants from his own time?
Well, put it this way, there are certainly precedents for absolute calumnious, slanderous depictions of historical characters. We don't have to look any further than Richard III, who he completely slanders. But Richard has had a lot of defenders over the years, whereas Hotspur hasn't really. Richard not only was totally different in reality from the way he's portrayed by Shakespeare, but actually Shakespeare's portrait affected how Richard was shown in other literature. Since you think of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Black Arrow, Richard in that book is straight out of Shakespeare and is actually a rather good addition to Shakespeare's portrayal. Stevenson actually captures it quite well. It's interesting because Shakespeare knew some of the Midland families. He knew southern families. He had travelled all over the South and the Midlands. His descriptions of scenes in the South, for instance, in King Lear, when he talks about looking over the cliffs at Dover and seeing the samphire pickers, and there's a lot of detail. Whereas when he sets something in the north, he will say, a northern chase. And actually there's a stage direction in one where the scene is a northern chase, and he specifies which actors, which is Sinklow and Humphrey, which were not even two of the main company, they were two of the hired men, they were the smaller part actors, are specified, but there's nothing about the landscape or the northernness of it that is in any way depicted or delineated. So his knowledge of the North is a knowledge of the Percys, or a depiction of the Percys, whether that is, as I'm saying, based upon close observation or not. But he doesn't have any more detail to add to anything else in the North than he shows in Henry IV, Part 1.
And Henry IV, Part 1 is the play in which Hotspur is one of the major characters. How do you feel about Hotspur as a character in Shakespeare? We're quite biased at the castle. We think of him as the real hero of the play. That's not the way he's always seen.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Shakespeare's portrayal has completely superseded the real Hotspur. I mean, you don't have to walk very far to see that. You can walk out of here, and inside the castle is that wonderful equestrian statue of Hotspur, which is a very romantic figure. You know, in the play, he talks about this Rhone shall be my throne, and he cries Esperance, you know. And that statue is absolutely that. But if you go down the street a little bit, there's another statue. So you'd say, okay, maybe this is the real Hotspur. But actually, the plaque on that is a quote from Shakespeare. Again, even in his hometown, we tend to go for the more romantic, we tend to go for the Shakespearean Hotspur rather than the historical one. Yeah.
What is it that works about the history plays? Is it the attempts at accuracy? Is it the drama? Is it when Shakespeare disregards the history? What's the most interesting parts of the history plays for you?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And actually, that's the question that every single person who ever puts on the history plays has to contend with. In actual fact, Shakespeare's history plays are not historical. Very little of what is in his plays is actually that accurate, but that doesn't matter. I mean, one thing I think is sad is that people in so many countries say, oh, they're just English history. They're not interesting for us in Japan or us in Russia or whatever. And I've actually spent a number of years going around the world telling people that they should read the history plays and don't see them as being English history. What they are is they're plays about the mechanism of history. They are plays about how power turns round. If you take them as a whole set, and there are problems with doing that because they were written at different times and in the wrong order and things, but if you take them as a whole set, there's a wonderful arc of English history that runs through them. But it's anybody's history. It's about who's up and about who's down. Jan Kot, the wonderful Polish scholar who kind of revolutionized Shakespeare scholarship in the 60s and afterwards, talks about there is usually a Henry, there is usually an Edward, there's usually a Richard, and one is up and one is down. He talks about the wheel, the great wheel. And this was a very Elizabethan philosophical concept, this thing of the wheel of fortune. And as one person rises, another falls. And the history plays are a great depiction of that. Now, some of them work better on their own than others. Henry IV, Part 1, works fantastically well as a play on its own, even without Part 2. Henry VI, Part 2, I don't think many people would turn off Great British Bake Off and put their coat on and go through the snow to see just that on its own.
Yeah, when the BBC made it as The Hollow Crown a few years ago, part of which was filmed at Alnwick Castle, but playing a French castle, they combined Part 1 and Part 2 into one episode.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, these plays, the Henry VI plays, were the beginning of Shakespeare's career as a writer. They're considered to be some of his very earliest works. And you can see why Talbot bashing the French and, you know, things like that. You can see there are various things that people would like. But actually, when the sequence ends with, because I would say Henry VIII is not really so much part of the sequence, but when the continuous sequence ends with Richard III, that was only, 79 years or something before Shakespeare? So there were people whose parents or grandparents had probably been at the Battle of Bosworth. They practically brought it up to the present day.
Including the Queen at the time.
Including, yes, absolutely. So if you look at some of the history plays, if I were, say, a theatre producer, I was talking to theatre producers in the Philippines this morning. If I were in the Philippines, I saw a production of Richard III there, which was absolutely wonderful. And I could say to them, oh, you know, I would love to see what you would do with Henry IV, Part 1. Henry V is a play which people sometimes will have a stab at, but not that often. But it's interesting because Agincourt, England, not Britain, can't even say Britain, although the Welsh were there too, England's greatest military victory before Shakespeare's time is depicted very differently in Shakespeare from the way it is in films. You think of the Olivier film of Henry V and that wonderful cavalry charge, and that cavalry charge in Olivier's film has created the way that we film Shakespeare often. Even in The Hollow Crown, when they were doing the Battle of Agincourt, even with television resources as opposed to movie resources, they still tried to do it that way. Shakespeare does not have the cavalry charge in his play. Shakespeare shows that through a couple of vignettes, including a rather comic scene with Pistol trying to make a French knight surrender. He does it through a comic scene. He does it through scenes of the desolation that follows the massacre of the boys in the camp. He doesn't actually show the battle. He shows plenty of other battles, the Battle of Philippi in Julius Caesar, all these things. But Britain's greatest military victory in Henry V, he does not show it.
He leaves it to the audience to imagine it, and does that give it more power?
Yes, or does it enable him to question some things about it as well? There's a very interesting analysis of Henry V by a playwright, John Arden, who sadly no longer is with us, but he writes about the early scenes of Henry V, and it's a very different perspective. It's about how the pictures you see on stage are actually depicting something different from what the text is saying. And that's very Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare wrote only one play set in his own time and place, and that was The Merry Wives of Windsor. Not necessarily his best. I mean, I like it, but it's not one of his best. And apparently he wrote it at the request of Queen Elizabeth. But all his other plays were separated either by time or by distance. Now, actually, in Shakespeare's time, any play script that was written had to be taken to the Master of the Revels to be vetted. And Edmund Tilney was the Master of the Revels a lot of the time. He would look at these scripts and he would pass them, or he might suggest some cuts. You know, you had to take out certain things, and then he would pass it for performance. But the thing is, what the audience saw and what the script said were very different. To begin with, in Shakespeare's time, nobody mounted plays in historical costumes. They were mounted in contemporary costumes. So you go to see a play about Henry VI, and actually people are dressed as they are in contemporary London. You're seeing a play about now, although nobody can complain because you gave the script to the Master of the Revels. There was a point where that all went horribly wrong, again with a history play, which was just before the Earl of Essex rebellion. They commissioned Shakespeare's company to put on a performance of Richard II, which has in it a deposition scene. And this was supposed to concentrate people's minds on the possibility before the Earl of Essex rebellion. And actually, John Hemmings, one of Shakespeare's partners, was called in for a very uncomfortable interview afterwards. But eventually they said, no, they were just a bunch of actors who took the money. You know, they were offered a lot of money to put this on, they did it. But Elizabeth actually turned round to her advisors and said, but I'm Richard II, surely you know that. So people could make the connections, and did make the connections, between the historical setting and the contemporary, as a matter of course.
A few minutes ago you mentioned Having a Stab, which is my perfect link to a play about Scottish history. We have a connection with Macbeth here at the castle as well. Malcolm III, the Scottish king on whom Shakespeare based the character of Malcolm, was killed just north of Alnwick Castle. How does the depiction of history change in a play that's also got ghosts and witches?
Yes, well, of course, Richard III has those things as well. Yeah, it's interesting because Macbeth was written probably as an attempt to curry favour with the new King James, who was, of course, Scottish. And it was probably written for an entertainment when his brother-in-law, Christian, came over from Denmark. Apparently, the visit of Christian of Denmark was mostly characterised by people getting absolutely palatic, particularly Christian. But anyway, the depiction of Macbeth is a complete calumny as well. Macbeth was actually a very good king. He made a pilgrimage to Rome where he was a legend for his generosity to the poor. Duncan, who in Shakespeare's play is a sort of kindly old soul, was actually a rather usurping and not very pleasant young king. And when Macbeth killed him, not many people were that bothered. I mean,
that wouldn't have made for as good a play.
No,
I don't
it
think.
wouldn't. Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. I mean, Shakespeare's source for a lot of this stuff was Holinshed's Chronicle. And Holinshed's Chronicle is fascinating and, worth studying entirely on its own as a work of literature. But people tend to look at it nowadays in relation to a source for Shakespeare. But Holinshed is the source for a lot of the stuff about Macbeth. Shakespeare also took some stuff from a book that James had written about witchcraft. James was fascinated by witchcraft, took part in witch trials himself. A lot of witches were put to death.
And he did suspect that a group of witches in Scotland had tried to assassinate him.
Indeed, he did.
Amy Simpson, I think, was one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the historical character of Macbeth is someone who actually could have given quite a good play of a very different type from Shakespeare's. I don't know that it would ever be worth anyone's while to do it now, but there are novel versions of it. I think Dorothy Dunnett wrote a novel called King Hereafter. There are a number of novels from the point of view of Lady Macbeth, who in Shakespeare's play doesn't have a name. Her actual name was Gruach. But that different perspective on the historical figures from the wives. There's a wonderful manga artist in Japan called Harumo Sanazaki who has done a couple of Shakespeare mangas, one from the point of view of Lady Macbeth, the story of Macbeth. The other is Romeo and Juliet from the perspective of Juliet's mother, and her whole thing is the silent voices or the semi-silent voices in Shakespeare's plays. And that's very interesting as well. But Macbeth, it's funny because Macbeth is probably the most popular Shakespeare play in the world. In different languages, it's often the first one translated. I've seen Macbeths in Bangladesh. I've seen them in India. I've seen them in Japan. I've seen them in China. Macbeth happens everywhere. I've seen one from Madagascar on film called Macbetho. There's a film made in Finnish Lapland of Macbeth with sledges and an ice palace and all sorts. Macbeth actually goes everywhere because in some ways Macbeth is the most straightforward. In other traditions like kabuki or Indian drama, psychological introspection of the type that Hamlet undergoes is not really that interesting for them. Macbeth, his motivations are more clear-cut. They're not straightforward by any means, but they are easier to follow. And Macbeth is a character type which you can find in virtually any sort of culture, really, any society.
Macbeth is another one that has been performed here at the castle, in the open air, in the grounds, with the towers and walls around it. You had directed a Henry IV here at the castle. Do you think the historic setting of a castle lends itself to Shakespeare performances, or is it more of a challenge?
It's got strengths and weaknesses. When I did mine, we did it in the Great Hall. And the plus was that when they were in the Boar's Head Tavern, there was a boar's head on the wall immediately above the stage. I've seen it done, my own son played Hotspur in an open-air production of the play here. And if you have different physical locations, that can be incredibly powerful and very evocative. The downside of it is, what do you do if it rains? Yes. I sat through a production of The Tempest once at Wallington Hall, and it was bucketing with rain. So the rain was running off the end of your nose, and to be honest, we all fled at the interval. There are downsides. But actually, the ending of that open-air production at Alnwick Castle was extraordinary because it was very cleverly stewarded, and it ended up with half the audience on one side of the field and the other half on the other. And one side were there for the King's army, and we were Hotspur's army. And actually, it was amazing because they got us really whipped up. And slightly cheating, they were shouting "For the North," which is actually from Game of Thrones, not from Henry IV. But actually, when Hotspur said "charge," it was all we could do to stop ourselves launching across to try to change the ending of the play and to change history. But no, I think the sounds of Hotspur's lines echoing round this castle were great. I mean, because actually, although northern accents don't really feature in Shakespeare, obviously, a lot of Hotspur's lines, he talks about drums and guns and wounds and words that actually do work very well in a Northumbrian accent. And actually to hear a Northumbrian accent echoing back off the walls of the castle was wonderful, actually.
A good tribute to the historical character and the Shakespearean tradition.
Yes, indeed.
And we have got Shakespeare coming back to the castle this summer. Twelfth Night will be performed by the 3-Inch Fools troupe, and you'll hear more about that at the end of this podcast episode. But one final question, a nice easy one to finish off. What's your favourite Shakespeare play?
My specialism as a director and as an actor has been the comedies. And I've directed Midsummer Night's Dream 4 times in several countries and been in it twice. That's a favourite of mine. Twelfth Night is probably my favourite of all the comedies. Although, As You Like It, I really... Oh, God. If I were to say which is Shakespeare's greatest play, I would say King Lear. That's one that I've never done yet.
Yet.
Well,
that seems like a nice open note to end things on. So I would say, Ronan Paterson, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today.
A great pleasure, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
If you'd like to see some Shakespeare at Alnwick Castle this year, you'll be able to see the 3-Inch Fools troupe performing this summer. Tickets for all their performances will be available from the Alnwick Castle website. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please let us know by leaving a review or a rating, subscribing to our podcast, or by letting us know on Twitter at Alnwick Castle, or by email on podcast@alnwickcastle.com. On the next episode of the podcast, we'll be looking at the Napoleonic period in Alnwick Castle's history, and the group of soldiers that was based at the castle to defend the northeast of England against French invasion. Until then, I've been Daniel, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.